And I've got some cookies, we call them. They're cutouts of trees. They tell the story of the forest, not only of the forest evolution, but of what species are capable of in terms of dealing with competition. I've assembled a collection of tree cookies here. That's what we call these cross sections we cut from the trees that tell us a lot about what's going on in the history of the forest. Each species has different capabilities in terms of how they grow and what happens under different site conditions, and also can tell us about the history of the whole forest over hundreds of years, written in the rings of the trees. This is an Alpine Fir species from a nearby national forest that was cut down. This is up at a very high elevation, and what you see is that this tree has struggled its entire life. This could be close to 200 years old. In the first 100 years, it's only about 2 inches in diameter. So this is one of those very suppressed trees. You almost need a magnifying glass to see the rings. But amazingly enough, even after 100 years of being heavily suppressed, it did catch a break in the last 4 or 5 decades of its life. Got some light, rings are much easier to see. So here's an example of a tree that really grew slowly to begin with and then really took off, and kinds of trees that you see up in the national forest that at high elevation that have lived a long time and will live for hundreds of more years. To contrast this old growth tree here with a vigorous young alder, this tree is only about 7 to 8 years old. And it's a little bit deceiving because it was cut down at the swell right near the base of the tree. So it's a little bit exaggerated, the growth rings, but here we have even more than an inch over here, which is about as fast as it's possible to grow a tree here in the Northwest. But if you were to plant redwoods and cedars in optimal conditions, they will put on 3/4 inch of growth, doubled for both sides of the tree, an inch or more a year. So this shows the exaggerated example of something that grows in ideal conditions. It's a red alder tree, and it has no competition at all, optimum conditions. This is a more typical alder. We have an alder-dominated forest here at Wild Thyme Farm. So this is a typical growth pattern where it grows very rapidly in the first 10 years of its life, and then a combination of competition and geometry slows it down to where it's very hard to see the growth and at about 40 to 50 years. And the reason why competition slows it down is pretty obvious. Sunlight is restricted, and so it has to compete with other trees, less growth. But the rings have to get smaller as the tree gets wider. This is an example of a tree that grows normally and its rings progressively get smaller. So I'm going to show you the exact opposite. Here's an alder that starts out big and gets tighter growth rings. This is a western hemlock that started out like our first cookie with very small growth and obviously suppressed tree until there was some event at this point, and for the next 10 years it grew abundantly. So it took a couple of years to recover from its suppressed state, and then it boomed out. It put on the foliage and it was able to grow rapidly. It's important to identify the species that are capable of this, because this is what's called a release. So if you have a crowded forest and you thin it out at the right time, you can release the trees to go into exceptional growth. Now this is much too suppressed. This is a natural tree in a suppressed environment. You would never manage a tree that grow that slowly. But it's important to note that hemlocks and cedars are capable of staying suppressed for a century, and they can be released after that. So you don't have to cut out the small trees. You can leave them in there. If you give them room to grow, they will grow. Our last tree cookie is a Douglas Fir grown on this property. It's approximately 100 years old, and like the alder, a Douglas Fir is not tolerant of shade, so that if it doesn't get released at an early age, it will die. And if it's really suppressed, it can't even last for 20 years. This tree was felled in a slide in 2022 So if you go back to 1922, that's when this tree started growing. Probably there was some harvesting back then, and it started out with very clear growth rings for the first 10 years. This was obviously a little bit suppressed, but even at year 10, the trees growing around it suppressed it even further, so it was one of the understory trees that struggled and struggled and struggled out until about year 40, whereas if you had optimal growth, a 40-year-old tree would be almost 3 feet wide. But this tree hung out until 1969 or 1970 from aerial photos that there was a major harvest. They didn't cut this tree, it was too small to be marketable for timber, so they left it grow. And then from 1970 on up until approximately 1996, responded rapidly, started growing, but then again it ran into competition again. In 1980s, 1990, 96, it stopped all over again. So it compressed back down to very slow growth, just like it did in 1969. And then something happened again. This is the 1996 ice storm that knocked down all the competition around this tree. So it resumed growing again. Took a couple of years to get recovered, and then it took off. And then the third time, after that ice storm recovered and the trees around it grew up, it started slowing down again. 3 waves from when it was born to the original cohort of trees that grew around it, and then they were harvested and it had another chance, got crowded by the trees that grew back then, and then the ice storm took out the competition and it took off. And when the trees recovered from the ice storm, this got shut down one more time until the landslide brought it down.